Welcome back to the Marvel Podcast for gifted listeners. Today we'll finish out our Marvel timeline, starting in 2000 and go all the way to 2024 when these episodes were written and recorded. And we're going to see how Marvel and the world changed in these past 2.5 decades. Now, let's get into our timeline. Now that Marvel had somewhat gone back on its feet, new blood was brought in. Bill Jemas was appointed the president of Marvel, and Joe Quesada was the new editor-in-chief. The duo was responsible for the creation of the Ultimate Universe. This was a universe which would be the future home to Miles Morales. The reason for creating this universe was to bring Marvel heroes into the modern age and to not disrupt the main continuity of the Marvel Universe, but still allow new stories to be created. This universe was also where the MCU took most of its inspiration from, at least in the early years. One prime example is that heroes didn't really have secret identities, and, of course, Nick Fury looking like Samuel L. Jackson. Also, the first decade of the 2000s brought us the beginning of Marvel big screen movies, of course, after Blade's success. But the popularity of Marvel movies didn't really begin until 2000 with the first X-Men movie. And in 2002, Marvel really hit it off with the original Spider-Man movie, starring Tobey Maguire and directed by Sam Raimi. The subsequent sequels to X-Men and Spider-Man surpassed their predecessors, and these movies introduced a whole new generation of fans to the world of Marvel Comics, myself being one of them. The original Spider-Man movie is actually my first introduction to Marvel Comics, and I loved it since. As with the past decades, Marvel kept pushing the limits of the maturity of their stories, with a set of books they called the Max series. These series of books would not adhere to the Comic Code's authority that Marvel had been following for so long. There were multiple titles in this line, some of which featured Black Widow, the Punisher, Deadpool, and Wolverine. Without having to adhere to the Comic Code's authority, these characters in the Max series were allowed to be more gruesome and more violent. During this time, Bill Jemas was the publisher of Marvel Comics, with Joe Quesada as the editor-in-chief. Even though Bill was able to bring Marvel back into profitable business, he is often criticized for micromanaging his writers and being heavily involved in their stories, and would be a controversial publisher by the end of his time. In 2004, Jemas had stepped down, and Dan Buckley took over as the publisher, with Quesada still as editor-in-chief. In 2001, tragedy hit the United States, with the 9/11 terror attacks that destroyed the World Trade Centers. Marvel responded to this by focusing two major stories on the event. One was The Amazing Spider-Man number 36. In this story, we see Spider-Man and numerous other Marvel heroes helping to clear the destruction that was left behind in the wake of the disaster. The heroes somberly remember that they couldn't save everybody. The other book that Marvel published in Millennium was Heroes. This book was a salute to all the brave first responders who had sadly lost their lives that day. It included a striking page that showed Captain America grieving over the smoking rubble that was Ground Zero. Also, in the original Spider-Man trailer, it featured the Twin Towers and Spider-Man catching a helicopter between them. Obviously, these scenes were removed from the movie due to what real-life disasters happened. A few years later, Marvel published the storyline of Civil War, which dealt with the Superhero Registration Act, where heroes had to register with the government so that they knew who the heroes were, because the main 616 universe, most heroes were not publicly known of who they were. The main hero who were in support of Iron Man's side of the Civil War was Spider-Man, who revealed his secret identity to the world, and this led to the One More Day storyline, which was another infamous Spider-Man story that we will cover in another episode. The Civil War comic event was the basis for the 2016 movie Captain America: The Civil War, where some of the details were changed to fit the narrative of the MCU, where instead of it being the Superhero Registration Act, it was the Sokovia Accords. But the general points were still there. Dan Buckley would be the publisher until 2017, when John Nee took over in 2018, and remains the publisher to today. Now, before we move on to the massive franchise that is the MCU, we'll just touch on a few more iconic storylines that came out in the past few decades, and which ones influenced the MCU movies, or will be used for future movies that we know of at the moment. In 2005, there was the House of M event, where Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, altered reality to make it so that mutants were the ruling class. When her brother Quicksilver was killed, she averted the world back to what it was, but simultaneously she would depower the majority of mutants to end tensions between humans and mutants. In 2007, there was World War Hulk, where Hulk had been exiled to space and became a gladiator. He would eventually become king of his new world. But when his exiled ship explodes and destroys the planet, he returns to Earth to exact his revenge on those who exiled him. Elements of the story we saw in Thor Ragnarok. In 2008, there was the Secret Invasion storyline, which showed Skrulls infiltrating Earth. Eventually, the heroes were able to root out the imposters and drive the aliens from their planet. This storyline was loosely adapted in 2023 in the Disney Plus series of the same name, which honestly really didn't do the original story justice. In 2014, the Spider-Verse miniseries debuted, showing us a whole world of spider people and bringing them together to fight a family of energy vampires who are hunting them down across the multiverse. This story would be loosely adapted for the 2018 animated movie Into the Spider-Verse, starring Miles Morales as the main Spider-Man. And one of the last big events we'll talk about in this little section is the 2015 Secret Wars, which is going to be the basis of the 6th Avengers movie, Avengers Secret War. In this event, we'll see parallel worlds of the Marvel multiverse come crashing together, and the fragments will form the Battle World. Within this world, the factions are on the verge of civil unrest. Eventually, Mr. Fantastic gains the powers of the Beyonder and reshapes reality. In 2027, we will see how this story gets adapted to the big screen. Now, before we continue into what was the thing that arguably made Marvel a household name again, we have to talk about 2 sad days during this section of the timeline. December 14th, 2011, which is the day Joe Simon passed away. And November 12th, 2018, the day Stan Lee passed away. This was like such a weird day for me because I remember distinctly I was at work. Stan Lee died. And so many people I knew were texting me. Like I knew him personally. Just because of how much of a fan of Marvel Comics I was. It was honestly a little insane how much people were like, oh my god, James is going to be so upset that Stan Lee died. And I was. And he is missed. But Marvel is still marveling on. Now, let's talk about Marvel's biggest franchise to date, that arguably brought another new generation into the world, expand the fan base far beyond the niche group of comic book fans, and made it more mainstream. Heck, my wife, who was never into comics before, she watched the first Iron Man, she's seen a few movies, and when we started dating, she asked me, hey, can we watch the MCU together? Because she knew I was such a big fan. And now, we see every movie when it comes out. So, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in 2005, Marvel was looking to produce movies on their own terms under the title of Marvel Studios. Because unlike the films that were being co-produced by Columbia, New Line, and 20th Century Fox, they wanted it to be produced under the Marvel Studios banner so that they had complete creative control over the process. Because when they were working with these other studios were still able to basically influence it how they wanted to. Avid Arad, who was the head of Marvel at the time, created Marvel Studios, which was the first new independent film studio created since 1994, when DreamWorks had been created. Kevin Feige was brought in as Avid's second-in-command to usher in this new universe. Feige had an idea of bringing heroes together like Lee and Kirby had done in the 60s. And since the studio had the rights to the Avengers, that is exactly what they did. The idea was to release individual films and then bring them together in one big crossover movie. Kind of how each hero in the 60s had their own individual books for being brought together in the first issue of the Avengers. So, in 2008, Iron Man was released to the public, and it was a hit. On a budget of $140 million, it grossed over $500 million at the global box office. After this success, Marvel had created 4 more movies before bringing all the heroes together in another box office smash hit, The Avengers. In 2009, Walt Disney Studios purchased Marvel Studios for $4 billion. Disney would not take over distribution of the Marvel movies until 2013, however, because Marvel had a previous contract with Paramount, so they had to wait for that to time out. So, for everyone saying that Disney ruined Marvel, Disney has been in charge of Marvel for a decade. Like, literally, most of the Infinity Saga was under Disney's tutelage. But anyway, the next big event when it came to the movie side of Marvel was their joint deal with Sony to use Spider-Man in 2015. The two studios reached an agreement where Spider-Man could appear in the MCU. Sony would continue to pay and have final creative control of any sort of future solo Spider-Man movies, but Marvel Studios would produce the film and serve as the creative lead. This meant Kevin Feige and his expert team would have the chance to shape the tone and style, pick the cast, and integrate the character into the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe. Meanwhile, Sony could still develop spin-offs and animated Spider-Man movies. And actually, the day before I recorded this, it was announced that the Sony Spider-Man universe was officially dead with the poor reviews of Kraven the Hunter. So, maybe we're going to get more villains in the MCU for Spider-Man than we originally thought. In 2019, we saw the release of Avengers Endgame, giving us a nice wrap to the Infinity Saga that had been going on for the 10 previous years, ending one story and opening the way for new ones to be told. I remember with Avengers Endgame, I bought tickets as soon as they went on sale. And then going to see it opening night was a theater experience I will never forget. One I also will probably never experience again. Like, the theater was absolutely packed. It was IMAX. When the portals open, people were losing their shit. When Cap got Mjolnir, oh my god, that was a moment that everyone went crazy for. My personal favorite was when Captain America said, "Avengers Assemble." Because I've been waiting for him to say that since it was teased at the end of Age of Ultron. I remember I was literally holding my popcorn bucket, crushing it in my hands with anticipation for him to say Avengers Assemble. And then when he did say it, and everyone lost their minds, I was also losing my mind. But let's move on to the next portion. Just wanted to give you guys a little look into what it was like as a first-hand experience seeing that movie on opening night. So, at the turn of the decade, the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and the world changed forever. In the comics, however, the pandemic was not addressed until 2022. In an interview with Tom Brevoort, a senior editor at Marvel at the time, he explained that if they had added the pandemic to the main continuity of 616, it would have made the universe very messy, stating that if they had added it to one storyline, it would have to expand across all storylines. At the time, there was no guarantee that everything was going to be alright, so they didn't want to introduce it and turn the whole universe upside down. There was a story in 2020 that was released outside of the main continuity to honor those on the front lines called Vitals. Marvel would team up with Allegheny Health Network to write a story about doctors and nurses working every day as a way to give a glimpse into these everyday heroes and what they were dealing with on a daily basis. And then in 2022, Marvel would team up with Pfizer and write another book called Avengers, Everyday Heroes, as a way to promote getting the Pfizer vaccine as well as booster shots. In late 2020, Marvel announced that Jonathan Majors had been cast as Kang the Conqueror, and that he would be the next Thanos-level threat to the MCU. However, after 3 appearances as different variants of Kang, and a real-life domestic violence conviction, Marvel dropped Majors and scrambled to switch its trajectory for the multiverse saga, now that it had lost its big bad. At Comic-Con 2024, it was announced that Doctor Doom would now be the next Thanos-level threat to the MCU, and Robert Downey Jr. would be playing the titular character. The casting has been met with varying degrees of excitement. As for myself, I truly don't think that Robert Downey Jr. is going to be the one true Doom. I think he's just going to be a variant that will get killed or become subservient to the one Doom above all. Well, thus we have reached the modern day when this episode was written and recorded. Thank you for traveling down this timeline of Marvel Entertainment with me, and I hope you'll stick around for future episodes that'll be more niche content to specific parts of Marvel, including character biopics, storylines, and just more detailed looks at many of the things that we have touched on over the past 4 episodes. The next episode is going to highlight my favorite character, Spider-Man. So, I hope you join us for that. Now, let's go over the top 5 things we learned today. Number 1. Marvel started the Millennium finding success in movies such as Spider-Man and X-Men, leading to a new interest in superheroes. Number 2. Real-life tragedies such as 9/11 and the COVID-19 pandemic were reflected in Marvel Comics one way or another, usually in one-shots to highlight just how the Marvel world would deal with such situations. Number 3. Some of Marvel's most regarded stories came out in the 2000s, such as Civil War, Secret Wars, and Spider-Verse, just to name a few. Number 4. The MCU was the next step in bringing Marvel heroes to be a household name. Now today, everyone knows about Marvel movies, whether they like it or not. And number 5. After years of film rights being scattered across different film companies, virtually all character rights have been reverted back to Marvel, and the MCU can finally tell stories they've wanted to without having to worry about what characters they can and cannot use. This episode was written and recorded by myself, James Bazinski. Intro music, timeline sound, and outro music were sourced from freesound.org. You can find us on Instagram at TMPFGL, a subreddit with the same name, and on YouTube at the Marvel Podcast for Gifted Listeners. Until next time, gifted listeners, Excelsior!